As the war in Yemen enters its fourth year, the United Nations says millions of people are in desperate need of food and medicine. Hello, I'm Ahmed, and this is The Heat. The war in Yemen has damaged the country's infrastructure, crippled its health system, and created a humanitarian crisis. The United Nations says more than 22 million people are in need of critical help. Saudi Arabia and an alliance of Muslim states intervened in Yemen's civil war in 2015 after the Houthis ousted the internationally recognized government in Sanaa. Since then, more than 10,000 people have been killed, mostly from Saudi-led airstrikes. In retaliation, the Houthis have launched dozens of missiles at the kingdom. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling for both sides to reach a political settlement to end the war.
And there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian crises. A negotiated political settlement through inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue is the only solution. And I urge all parties to engage with my new Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, without delay. And I reiterate my call for full respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure.
There's much to discuss about the Yemen war. Here with us in the studio is Sanaa Al-Hamdani. She's a Yemen political affairs commentator. From Jeddah, we're joined by Fahad Nazer. He's a columnist for Arab News. And Seche served as U.S. ambassador to Yemen from 2007 to 2010 and is currently the executive vice president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sanaa, let me start with you. The war is now in its fourth year. 10,000 lives lost in this war, many more wounded, 40,000 wounded, we understand. What do you know about the humanitarian situation in the country right now?
It's really hard to know something. I've been on this show several times now, and we keep talking about the humanitarian devastation and the escalation of it, and now that it's like a full-fledged catastrophe and the biggest crisis that the humanitarian world is facing today, we don't know that these numbers remain that low. It might be, I suspect, a lot higher. Those are the casualties that result as a direct result of war. There are those who die because of lack of access to medication or just for other consequences. So I assume that the numbers are going to be far more devastating if we really have an opportunity to explore Yemen fully, because right now it's an active war site, and so you have to make do.
Well, let me bring in Fahad from Jeddah. And Fahad, this onslaught on Yemen, on the Houthis in Yemen, which has claimed so many civilian lives, is being led by Saudi Arabia, assisted by other countries as well as the United States. What is the Saudi endgame here? What does Saudi Arabia hope to achieve?
Right, so I think we always have to remember how this conflict began. This conflict began when the Houthis felt that they had a right to impose their will on the rest of Yemen. There was a national dialogue, there was a transition taking place, and they, for whatever reason, felt that they did not want to be a part of those discussions and took up arms and toppled the internationally recognized government of President Hadi. And, you know, that was a choice. This was a choice that they made. But I think that the government of Hadi the response was necessary. Obviously, they were moving. They were moving south. The tactics they were using and have continued to use have violated all sorts of laws and norms of warfare. And you know, it didn't take long for the government of President Hadi to appeal to the international community, to Yemen's neighbors more specifically, and that's when Saudi Arabia joined this effort, again after it had received an official request from the internationally recognized government of Yemen to dislodge the Houthis from the areas that they took by force. That's how the conflict began. Yeah. It will end when the Houthis lay down their weapons and they go back to the negotiating table and get away from this idea that they can impose their will by force on the rest of Yemen.
So very quickly, Fahad, the Saudis are open to negotiation. They're not just, the bottom line is not the fact that the internationally recognized government must be restored.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Saudi officials have said that there certainly would be supportive of a political resolution. That's
Right.
certainly one of the tracks that they're following. But they're also doing, you know, contrary to the prevailing perception, they're doing quite a bit to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. So by Saudi calculations, and they have some pretty concrete numbers, they have provided over $8 billion worth of aid to Yemen. Now, this has come in the form of medicine, of food, of $2 billion worth of assistance to the central bank. There are hundreds of thousands of Yemenis living inside Saudi Arabia,
right,
who are receiving medical care and education. So, and this is also in addition to the 500 million plus that was just given to the UN plan for Yemen. So they're doing quite a bit on that front to make sure that that the humanitarian suffering is alleviated. And absolutely, right. I mean, ultimately they see a political end to this conflict.
Okay, Ambassador, the United States is deeply involved in this war. It has been supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, other assistance as well. What does the U.S. hope? How does the U.S. expect this war will end?
I think the administration is suddenly waking up to the fact that the war has gone on too long, has metastasized into a regional conflict, and it's deeply unstable and unsettling in the region. So I think what we're seeing now is the White House beginning to mobilize more frequently and more robustly than in the past. And part of this is prompted by, first of all, the anniversary, which has brought a lot of public attention to the humanitarian dimensions of the conflict, and secondly, by the fact that our Congress has demonstrated a lot of impatience with the fact that the war has gone on as long as it has without resolution. And I think the administration, and I think that Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis talked about this when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was visiting recently, that there is going to be a negotiated end to this, not a military end, because this cannot be won militarily.
But the U.S. Senate actually just voted to continue support for Saudi Arabia.
But they got 44 votes, in fact, in opposition to that. So I think
it was a close vote, yeah.
Yeah, it was 55-44. You can begin to see now that there is, as I say, a lot of frustration that this is not being resolved through a political negotiation. And that is really the urgent need right now, is to create that framework that will allow both parties, all the parties, because this is a multipolar conflict. It's not binary anymore. There are a lot of parties to the conflict. They all need to be brought into the tent, make this an inclusive process that will give people the optimism they can bring the war to an end.
Well, we can go right now to Sanaa. Joining us from Sanaa is Radhya Almutawakel. She's the chairperson of the Mwatana Organization for Human Rights. Radhya, thanks for joining us. We've been talking here about the humanitarian situation in Yemen. You are there right now. We understand the situation is very dire. What are you seeing and hearing there?
The only systematic and clear thing in this war, it's the human price and the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. We should remember that it's a man-made disaster. It's a conflict disaster. So all the violations that have been committed by all parties to the conflict in Yemen has led to this disaster. And it is until now the only clear thing in Yemen. There is no war plan that is, committed. Parties to the conflict, they don't have a war plan, they don't have a peace plan. But what is very clear to us, that they are continuing and targeting civilians in different ways, whether it is Houthis or it is the Saudi and Emirati coalition or their allies and armed groups under Hadi authority in the ground. All kinds of violations are committed by these groups, and it is not known until when and why. It's good to talk about the beginning of this war when Houthis controlled Sanaa by force, but it's also good to talk that we have now, after 3 years of the war, and what is the result? And I will just ask Saudi Arabia, what is the result of this war until now? Beside killing thousands of civilians, we in Mwatana has documented hundreds of incidents that is committed by Saudis. They have striked everything in Yemen, and thousands of civilians were killed, and most of them are women and children. The same kind of violations that is committed by Houthis, like indiscriminate shelling, landmines. But what is next? If you just ask any party to the conflict, what is next, they will not answer you. They don't know what they are doing in Yemen.
Sanaa, this is a war that pits the Houthis against an Arab coalition, Arab-US coalition, I could say, led by Saudi forces. Is there any way of telling what the strength of the Houthis are right now?
I mean, it's kind of a moving situation, meaning that one day they have control of one region, the other day they don't, especially on the borders. But I think for 3 years, we have somewhat a clear outline of what region the Houthis control and what regions they don't control. But the problem is the regions that are not controlled by the Houthis are also suffering from the humanitarian crisis, and they are suffering from chaos. And that's really alarming, because the problem then becomes not to just help Yemen get rid of the Houthi militia, but to also how do you stabilize a country like that? And I think the problem is the Yemenis are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, they have the Houthis on one hand, and then they have the Saudi coalition on the other hand. Both are trying to win this militarily, and they're just suffering the consequences of the actions of the other party without being directly involved to it. And I kind of want to mimic what Radhya just said for a second, that nobody seems to know or have a clear plan of what they want out of Yemen. If you recall, you asked the other guest, what is the end game here in Yemen? It's not clear what the end game looks like, although I would say politically speaking, this is a political problem, and it needs to be solved diplomatically through political channels, through diplomatic channels, because militarily, it's only getting worse. After 3 years of war, we've now lost the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who looked like a middle ground. And it's now looking like a full-on proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is definitely not great when you look at what's happening in the region in general, especially with what's happening parallel to it in Syria, in Iraq. You know, Yemen right now looks like a place that if you can solve it, if you can stabilize that region, it is in the advantage of the US and of the region and Saudi Arabia specifically, since it's the bordering neighbor directly to Yemen.
Let me go back to Fahad on some of the points that were raised by Radhya. Fahad, Radhya raised the point, you know, we've had 4 years of war, thousands of civilians being killed, thousands more wounded, and tens of thousands displaced. From a Saudi point of view, after 4 years of war, what has been the point of this war?
Well, the Houthis have lost a fair amount of ground over the past few years. The other group that is also on its heels is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, those two groups are to a great extent why Saudi Arabia felt compelled to enter this conflict in the first place, because the prospect of not just one, but two very militant, very irresponsible groups, the Houthis in the north and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in the north, holding Yemen hostage and wreaking havoc, presented a very serious threat to Saudi Arabia's security and the security of the region. I was actually in Riyadh yesterday as the ballistic missile was intercepted. I was at a meeting, and as soon as I came out, I heard a loud boom, looked up in the sky, and saw the smoke. It created a little bit of tension for a few minutes, but life went on. People went about their business, and that tells you really two things. One is that Saudis have confidence in the efficiency of their air defense systems, but it also tells you, frankly, that this has happened before. So the Houthis continue to do this. They continue to escalate and to perhaps trying to get the Saudi Arabia to respond. But I actually think Saudi Arabia has shown great restraint. I mean, it has very advanced weapons and could probably win this war much more easily if the Houthis were not using civilian infrastructures, if they were not using the cities, if they're not hiding their personnel and their weapons inside cities. But that's what they've done. They have basically taken the entire, or certainly the regions that they've held over, they've taken it hostage, and they've shown complete disregard for the well-being of the people of Yemen. And in fact, if I could just add one more point, I've spoken to Yemeni officials, scholars, journalists, and activists, many of whom at this point don't make a distinction between the Houthis, Al-Qaeda, and Daesh, in the sense that they say none of these groups they could care less about the safety and security of Yemen. The only thing they know how to do is fight, and they have no interest in peace.
Well, let me go to Radhya on some of the things that you've talked about there. Radhya, we just heard Fahad tell us that the Saudis have shown great restraint. He told us earlier on that Saudi Arabia is also doing a lot to alleviate the humanitarian suffering in Yemen. What is your response to that?
The cheapest way to just stop the suffering in Yemen is to stop the war. people in Yemen, they want to have their life again, and they'll go to the work and feed themselves again. And yeah, Houthis are armed group who are committing a lot of violations, but in many of the incidents that Mwatana has documented, Saudi coalition has struck areas and houses where no military target were there. Most of the survivors and family victims are asking why we were targeted while there is no military target behind us. In many incidents, civilians can just avoid this disaster, but they have never been avoided because they were targeted. And in the war in Yemen, they will keep on saying there is no heroes in Yemen. We have only criminals and victims. And Houthis should stop saying that we are bad because Saudis are bad, and Saudis should stop saying we are bad because Houthis are bad, because both sides are bad. And if you just see the areas that is controlled by Hadi and their allies, I mean Emirates and Saudis, people also there are suffering. They are suffering from various violations. I mean, Hadi government and their allies, they didn't even try to build something like a state. They didn't try to rebuild the judiciary system. They are controlling these areas by armed groups. So we have armed groups all over Yemen, with their Houthis or with under the authority of Hadi and their allies.